As a professional game master, one of the most important things that's part of your role is really sharpening your emotional intelligence skills. Emotional intelligence is one of those buzzwords, but I think it's really useful in this context because you have to understand that tabletop exercising tries to put people in a very heightened state of emotion where you apply pressure and make situations where people are going to be not in their usual context. So we're going to touch on 5 or 6 ideas within emotional intelligence and how the understanding of those mental models can really help assist you in the role of a GM in running a really good tabletop. Hopefully these skills should be useful for your home games as well as in a professional context. First mental model is just recognizing that emotions play a role at the tabletop. They're actually required. We're trying to simulate complex humans in a complex situation making hard decisions. We're trying to simulate emotions. If we get emotions at the table, we're actually doing a good job in a professional context or at home. It means people are invested. It means they're immersed, and it means they're feeling the stakes, which is exactly what we want. It can really inform the responses at the table and the interactions during gameplay, and it can lead to a really good outcome. Even negative emotions can lead to a good outcome. And what I mean by that is if someone does experience stress or anger, learning to regulate those emotions or handle them well is the whole reason why tabletop exercising works so well. Now, being an excellent GM and understanding that emotions are going to be at the table if it's a good game, you can actually start to prepare for what you think might happen at the table before you even sit down. Have a think about the scenario. What is the situation? And how do you think the players are going to interact? There are going to be obvious times of tension or crux moments within the scenario or the exercise. You might expect someone to feel very upset or very angry. Now, it's okay for the player or the character to have those emotions, but only within the boundaries that are acceptable at the table. Really stressing up the top what are acceptable behaviours and not acceptable behaviours at the table is super important. I even print off a list of rules for the players at the table, so that if someone I can feel is maybe overstepping that boundary, I can point to it and say, hey, look, we decided that we were not going to go there. It's very important to keep that inclusive environment, but even if you're strategically stressing people in an environment where the aim of the game might be to be exclusive, you still need to make sure there are those clear boundaries and that you can meet the game objective without overstepping those boundaries. Recognizing and having a sense of the tempo of emotions is really important. That helps you set times of tension, times of easing tension. It can help narratively quite a lot, but it can also help drive up the stakes and the emotions within the players. You can use their emotions to good if you can recognize and tune in with that tempo of how quick, how intense. And remembering back to our 2 hats we wear as a GM, you can use both the referee and the guide to set the tempo of the emotions at the table and dial it back down if necessary. Now, active listening is the second thing we're going to go through. This is a hugely important thing in managing group dynamics, is you need to learn when to step back. It's usually when the game master is doing nothing and saying nothing that the best gameplay actually happens between players. You should lead the way in active listening and expect it of your players as well. If you see someone talking over someone else, you should step in as the referee and encourage active listening. It just improves the overall game experience. Topic number 3 here is effective communication. Obviously, all communication that you do should be clear and respectful. That can prevent a lot of misunderstandings and tensions. But you have to understand it is actually hard to communicate as a player sometimes, especially if you're not familiar with role-playing. You don't know when to speak as yourself, you don't know when to speak as your character or the role that you're playing. It's a really good idea to help guide people to speak in their role or character most of the time and to speak as their player some of the time if it's outside of the game communication that's necessary. Number 4 is talking about a barometer for conflict. Conflict is essential in a tabletop exercise to some degree. In the end, we're trying to make decisions or navigate situations that are complicated and might not have easy answers. Simulating conflict might actually be the aim of the exercise, but you as the game master need to have this internal barometer to understand where the conflict is and if it's in the right bounds. Now, this can mean you need to shift people's conflict levels up to get to the appropriate level. It can also mean you need to de-escalate things. And some strategies here include de-escalating, negotiating, or finding some common ground if there's some disagreements. In the end, you have to make sure that the group who's playing the game achieves their objective and that they don't leave the game in a worse state than when they entered. The 5th thing, and more of a mental model that we're going to talk about, is the concept of leadership and influence within the game and at the table. There might naturally be some leadership and influence power dynamics that come to the table with the players. Bosses might be playing with underlings. The stakeholders at the table might be competitors. And that might change with their role inside of the game. Also, people who maybe don't have positions of power can end up being really good leaders inside of the game or taking a little bit of a control or a handle on the situation. Having a good constructed mental model of where the power dynamics are at the table and also inside of the game is a really important mental model to keep in your head. This is crucial so the players inside the game have equal opportunity to participate and contribute, as well as the chance for people to practice their leadership skills. Depending on the situation, it's always a good idea up front to mention this concept of power in your table rules and map it to what the objective is. If at the table there's a whole heap of different levels of seniority, but the exercise requires them to act as equals, it's a really good idea to mention this up front. This way you can avoid people pulling rank, and it leads to a much better debrief. That point leads on really well to number 6, which is fostering an inclusive atmosphere. You have to be aware of the sensitive nature of the diverse backgrounds you might get sitting at the table. No matter what the situation or the exercise, all players should feel valued and respected, even if they're playing a role that might not be valued and respected within the game. In fact, after all of these points, it's probably worth mentioning that this inside game, outside game, player character dynamic is a really important mental model that players may not understand until they sit at the table. There are so many great RPG resources here to make inclusive tables. I'll link some below that are my favourites. I specifically like the X card terminology, where you have some things that are discussed with the group prior that are topics that we just don't go towards, which are an X, and veils, which are topics that we might address but just not full frontal topically. For example, it might be okay to have an off-screen death, but abject descriptions of violence and gore and horror might not be appropriate. Finally, rounding out at number 7, long list, I know, is the mental model of self-regulation and adaptability. Probably the most advanced skill and the hardest when you're at the table, juggling the responsibility of all the players and the player characters and yourself as the referee and yourself as the game guide, is self-regulating your own emotions well. Especially in stressful situations, especially important people, it can be pretty challenging. I think the key here is just being honest with yourself, having flexibility and being adaptable to all the different situations, as well as trying to prepare what might happen. You have to be okay to make real-time adjustments, especially if things go off the rails or if something happens that you don't want to happen. Try to maintain a positive atmosphere, a good table culture, and I always try to have a few touchstones that I can bring myself back to if I'm feeling a bit out of my depth, or if things aren't going how I'd planned, or if I can start to feel myself feeling stressed or anxious. Those touchstones for me are giving myself a bit of time. Sometimes I'll create a little bubble of space that I can breathe in by asking one of the players to just describe how their character is feeling at the moment, or to ask someone what their summary of the situation is at the moment. Basically asking a question, which is going to take about a minute to someone to answer. And I can use that minute to just take a breath, refocus, and regather. Second touch point for me is always the aim and objective. I've stressed this like 100 times on how important it is, but the reason I say that is because I always come back to it. If a session is going way off the rails, what are the things that you can do to get back to the main objective that might need some real-time adjustments? And lastly, a debrief process is really good for the learning objectives, but I myself often need a debrief process, and I think every game master should. That's one of the reasons why I want to try to improve this culture of practice, is to have a firm network of people who get it, who can hear your stories of woe and embarrassment and share in those triumphs as well. These games do have weight, and you do hold a level of responsibility. You have to remember it's a very dynamic situation, and it's not always going to go to plan. In fact, it hardly ever goes 100% to plan. So you have to have a good, productive way of unpacking for your own emotional stability. One bonus little tip: I know I always have to be in the right mindset and mood to facilitate well. So getting a pre-game routine is really important. I always make sure I do a little bit of exercise before a game, really make sure I open strong, and have a couple of songs that I can listen to just to get in the right frame of mind. Hope some of those tips helped. Next, we're going to talk about the key operations and logistics components of actually implementing an exercise. Stay tuned. Thanks for watching. These lessons will be dropping weekly on YouTube, but if you want to get them all right now, you can take the foundation course for free on our website, where you will also get the lesson notes, summaries, assignments, checklists that guide you through all the learning objectives we've covered. At the end of that course, you'll also get a certificate of completion and an invite to our directory and community, where you can meet some other game masters and use the Long Game Project as a platform to showcase your work. If you want to take your game mastery further, completion of this course is a prerequisite to unlock the advanced professional course, along with the Game Master track, where we dive deeper into the content and further along the skill tree. You can also check out some of our other free tools in the description below, including our tabletop exercise starter kit, our scenario generator, the trove of existing scenarios, our SOP checklist library, and our new RPG character sheet, CV, and LinkedIn template, which is really cool. I did mine this morning, and now all my network knows that my dump stat is probably Dex, and I'm definitely neutral good. Roll on!